Right, so yay, so welcome everyone. So happy Tu B'Shvat. We had a chance to chat about Tu B'Shvat before, and help yourselves to the buffet as we keep going, please. Um, and we are ready for the last class in this series. And I just want to start off by saying that by no means is this the end of any story. It's the end of the specific chapter that we are focusing on. But as we know, the history of the Jews is ongoing for thousands of years. So we're certainly not ending a story that came to a conclusion. But we're going to be focusing on the last installment of the story of the Exodus of Egypt. And God willing, we will have many opportunities for further discussion about the stories and further discussion about what comes later and all of that. But for this particular series, here we are. We are right after the ninth plague. So just to recap, the plagues that were brought upon the Egyptians were very, very detailed and very unique forms of God sending people a message, and certainly a very, very specific interaction with the Egyptians that measured the behavior that the Egyptians exhibited towards the Jews. And the lessons that they were taught along the way were vital and powerful and definitely set the tone for what God was not only teaching the Egyptians, but more specifically teaching the Jewish people. And as we said, that the plagues served as this time period for the Jewish people to change their mindset and to become more imbued with the mindset of freedom and to shed the persona of a slave. And this was something that took a lot of time and took a lot of, step by step teaching and progress and experiences. And each plague served as one step closer towards the Jews shedding their slavery mindset. And at the end of the ninth plague, excuse me, every single one of these Jews was ready to leave Egypt. We spoke about last week how there were some Jews who were very weak in their faith and they didn't want to leave Egypt. They were scared of what was to come. And unfortunately, they didn't survive the epidemic that swept through the Jewish nation during the plague of darkness. And in an effort to preserve the Jewish dignity and the Jewish strength, God, narrowed down the population of the Jews during the plague of darkness so that the Egyptians wouldn't witness other Jews dying and, become more strengthened in their resolve. Oh, look, they're also getting plagues. So unfortunately, many Jews died during the period of darkness. And it was after this plague that the Jewish people were now all with one focus and one mindset that they are ready to leave Egypt. And that was when Moshe warned Paro of the 10th plague. Now, the warning for the 10th plague was very, very explicit. Moshe told Paro exactly what would happen. And while that was taking place, the Jews were also having an interesting experience. So let's start off with what was happening in the Egyptian life, and then we'll move to what was happening in the Jews' lives. So Moshe gives Paro very, very specific warnings. The 10th plague would be the death of the firstborn. And every firstborn would be killed. And not just the firstborn son of every family, but the oldest of every family, whether it was the firstborn of a mother or the firstborn of a father. So anyone who had multiple wives would have several firstborns as well. If there would be no firstborn in the home, the oldest member of that family would suffer this terrible plague, and the consequences would be huge. And the Egyptians were terrified. The Egyptians were absolutely terrified. You know, they say, fool me once, fool me twice. The Egyptians were not going to be fooled again. They saw that every single thing that Moshe had predicted, that Moshe had warned about, and that Moshe had promised. Oh, I wasn't focused, but do you mind checking? Thank you. Every single thing that had been warned about came true exactly the way Moshe had said it. And this was now their lives on the line. And it was scary. And what they wanted was for the Egyptians to just let the Jews go already. I mean, come on. We're going to let them go. We may as well do it before we all die. And that was something that was the very prevalent feeling amongst, hi, come on in, welcome. The very prevalent feeling amongst many, many Egyptians. They were scared. And they knew at this point that this wasn't just magic. This wasn't just an empty threat. This was a real, real threat to their existence. And this started causing a lot of unrest in Egypt. While all of this turmoil was happening in Egypt amongst the Egyptians, the Jews were going through their own thing as well. Mm. Moshe let the Jewish people know that the redemption was imminent, and it was time to start preparing for the actual exodus from Egypt. And the preparations were very specific. This would be the first Passover experience. Now, when we celebrate Passover, we celebrate the exodus from Egypt, and we celebrate the fact that God took us out of Egypt. But we're also commemorating the first Passover that actually took place in Egypt. Before the Jews left Egypt, they celebrated the first Passover. And that was with the offering of the Korban Pesach, which was the Paschal lamb, the Pesach sacrifice. And there was a preparation process for it. And the Jews were all instructed to take a small little lamb and tie it to their beds. It's time to get yourself a little house pet and keep it there for several days. Now, just to understand the feelings of like the indoctrinated fear that was so instilled within the Jews towards the Egyptians, the Jews were terrified because the sheep was considered a god, a deity that the Egyptians worshipped. And now they would take the god of the Egyptians and tie it to their bed. The Egyptians would want to know what they were doing with it. And they would have to say, oh, we're going to slaughter it. And that would be the scariest thing. And the Jews were very, very afraid. And that's exactly why God told them to do it. They would be afraid. That's okay. Because their faith in God would be stronger than their fear. And they would do it anyways. And that's what they did. The Jews took this lamb and tied it to the sides of their beds. And the Egyptians are walking through the streets and they see all of the Jews, their former slaves, are now walking with these lambs, and they say, "What are you doing?" And they say, "Oh, we're keeping these lambs. We're going to slaughter them and bring a sacrifice for our God and make a delicious meal." And the Egyptians were struck. They were frozen. They were frozen. God made it impossible for them to react negatively towards the Jews. Hi, welcome.
Sorry, I'm late.
No, come on in. How you doing? You look wonderful. Please come sit down.
Anyone sitting here?
You, perfect. Help yourself to some fruits. Welcome. So the Egyptians were frozen and they were unable to react and respond. And that scared them. Like, we can't fight. We can't stand up for our gods. Like, what's going on? But God made it impossible for them to harm the Jews. And this was the important message that God was sending to the Jews at this time, which is, don't worry. You don't have to be afraid. And even if you are afraid, do it anyways. And that is such a powerful lesson about faith. And this is why this was the first step towards the exodus from Egypt, which is it's okay to be scared. Many times we think that faith means being fearless. But the truth is, it's not at all. It's being afraid, but doing the right thing anyways, because your faith in God is stronger than your fear. We don't say that the fear doesn't exist. We don't deny the fact that something is scary or that it requires risk or that it requires bravery or that it requires putting things on the line. But we do it anyways because our faith is stronger than our fear. And that is what the Jews had to experience in order to be ready to leave Egypt and enter into this unknown journey that they were going to embark on. Because if you think about it, the Jews were leaving Egypt, but they had no idea where they were going. They had no clue what life was going to be like after. And that was scary. In fact, one of the things that God says as praise for the Jewish people is the fact that we followed God into the desert. We just followed blindly, and that's scary. But our faith was stronger than our fear. And that's something that we can tap into. And that was something that they needed to learn before they were able to go into the desert and live this fearful and yet powerful and beautiful experience of following God faithfully. So the Jews tie this sheep to their beds and they're getting ready to perform the sacrifice, which would be to sacrifice the lamb. And the blood of the Korban Pesach would be painted onto the doorposts of each Jewish home. So now, usually when you move in, you do a paint job. They were doing a paint job when they were moving out. Not exactly the same kind of paint job. Hi, come on in, welcome. And the paint job was just on the doorposts, and it was blood. At the same time, all of the Jews who were not yet circumcised underwent a circumcision as well. And they were marking their homes as Jewish homes. They were marking this space as a space where the Jews lived. And there was a reason for that, which we'll get to next. So now I want you to picture the scene. The Egyptians are freaking out because they know that they're going to die. And they know that their king, who's supposedly the one who takes care of them, doesn't care. And they see the Jews doing all of these really weird things. It's not something new that we Jews do weird things. They're doing weird things back then too. Weird, very unusual rituals that the Jews are doing, and they're very unnerved by all of this. And they go to their fathers, the Egyptians, and they say, "What are you going to do to protect us? We're going to die. We are the firstborns. What are you going to do to keep us alive?" And they say, "Sorry, take it up with Paro." And they go to Paro. And the firstborns storm the palace and say, "What are you giving us? Are you giving us the sacrifices? Let the Jews go already so we can live." And Pharaoh says, "No, sorry, not going to happen." And by the way, Pharaoh was quaking in his boots because he was a firstborn, but he was not going to let anyone know about that yet. And this caused a very, very big revolt. And it turned into a civil war. And this is actually one of the incredible miracles that the Jews watched the Egyptians turn on themselves. And they saw how the people who had once been so powerful and so masterful, and the ones who controlled their lives, are now fighting for their own lives. And this gave them an incredible amount of confidence. And they now saw that the ones who had played with their lives now felt like their lives were at stake. And this was a huge civil war. And there was a huge death toll in Egypt even before the plague began. So just the warning and the threat of the plague caused a significant amount of loss in the already downtrodden Egypt. And it was the night of the 15th of Nisan. And the Jews were preparing for the Korban Pesach. Now, they had brought the sacrifice and they were already roasting the meat in the afternoon. And they sat down to eat in their homes, and they were given very specific instructions. But before we get to those instructions, I want to just focus on the date for a moment. The date of the 14th of Nisan in the Torah is called the 14th day of the first month. Now, let me ask you a question. What month is Rosh Hashanah? Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year. So you would think that Tishrei would be the first month. But in fact, in the Torah, the first month is Nisan. Now, we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the new year, in the first day of the Jewish calendar, because that is the month, the day that Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, were created. That's from the creation of the world. But the Torah actually calculates the months by number, not by name. The first month, the second month, the third month. And the count begins from when the Jews left Egypt. So the month that the Jews left Egypt is considered the first month, because that is when the Jews were born as a nation. That is when we began our lives as free people. That is when we began our journey as a nation that was not slaves to Egypt, but that was subservient to God in a partnership, not in a slavery. And the new month, the first month, was actually the beginning of when God introduced the Jewish people to the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. Now, Rosh Chodesh is the mitzvah that's actually given to women. And Rosh Chodesh follows the cycle of the moon, that we consider the first day of the month to be the day when the moon is at its beginning of its cycle, which mimics the cycle of a woman. And the lunar calendar, which is the Jewish calendar, goes according to the lunar cycle, is a reflection of the waxing and waning of the Jews, of the Jewish woman, and of the moon. And interestingly, this was the first mitzvah that was given to the Jewish people before they left Egypt as a mitzvah, a specific commandment that was given, and that is the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. And it is so apropos that that is the mitzvah that is specifically given to women, because the Torah tells us that it was in the merit of the women that we were actually freed from Egypt, that it was the courage and the faith and the bravery of the women who brought about the incredible, powerful rebirth of the Jewish people and the growth of the Jewish people within the time period of slavery, and which brought about the redemption as well. So the Jews were counting from the beginning of Rosh Chodesh, and they entered into this day, the 14th of Nisan, and then the evening was the 15th. And these were the instructions that they were given. Every household was to share the meal. If anyone didn't have enough people in their home to finish the meal completely, they could, potluck it. They could have a few families come together to eat the Korban Pesach. They ate it along with matzah and maror. The matzah actually being the bread of freedom and the bread of affliction, meaning it was the bread that they ate on the cusp of freedom, but it was the bread of affliction because it's so basic and bland, to remind us of the pain and the suffering and all of that, along with the maror, the bitter herbs, again, to remember the pain and the suffering, along with the delicious, succulent roast lamb to contrast the bitterness and the freedom. And they were eating in their homes, and they were not allowed to leave their homes until the morning, because God was doing the 10th plague, and nobody was allowed to leave their homes. And so they were in their homes. Now, they were actually given a dress code. It wasn't black tie. It was belts on, meaning that they were dressed, ready to go. They had their clothes, their shoes, their belts, their traveling packs ready to go. And this idea of being ready to go was that they should eat the Korban Pesach in Egypt, but already with a mindset of leaving Egypt. Not to say that now that we have this delicious meal and we're free and we're living in Egypt, we may as well stay here as free people. No, we are one foot out the door. We are free because we are leaving, but they wouldn't leave until the next day. So in the Egyptian homes, there was already a lot of death and destruction because of the civil war. And at the stroke of midnight, there was a tremendous cry, a wail of pain coming from every Egyptian home, because in every single home, there was a death. In every single home, the firstborn of the home perished, either died instantly or became very, very ill, or any other form of death that came upon them. Now, this seems to be like, why the firstborn? Like, what's the deal? Nobody chooses to be a firstborn, right? Nobody chooses where they're going to be in the family. But this was measure for measure, because the Jewish people are considered God's firstborn child. Every person in the world is God's child. God created every single one of us some Jews, some non-Jews, equally. But the Jews are considered God's firstborn. And so God says, you kill my firstborns, I kill yours. And this was a very, very strong message because the firstborns in Egypt were given tremendous honor, were given tremendous powers that were attributed to them, and were the decision makers in Egypt. And all of the really cruel masters and the ones who had made all of these terrible laws and everything towards the Jews were all firstborns, including King Pharaoh himself. And this was very, very, very dramatically painful for the Egyptians. In the meantime, the Jews were at home, feasting and celebrating and preparing for the redemption. And not only that, the Egyptians had a shrine in their homes for any firstborn ancestor or child who had passed. They would either make a statue of their likeness, or they would have an engraving in the wall of their likeness. And those statues or engravings as well started crumbling. They started breaking. And not only that, all of the idols in Egypt were destroyed along with the firstborns. So if it was metal, it started melting. If it was wooden, it started rotting. If it was stone, it started crumbling. There was only one idol left in Egypt at the end of this plague. And the reason that God didn't destroy this idol called the Baal Zephon was because that was what the Egyptians turned to when they weren't sure what to do later on. And they thought that that idol was the one that was telling them to chase after the Egyptians, to chase after the Jews, which is what led to the splitting of the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the only reason why God left that one idol. But all of the idols were gone. And the Egyptians were left in a state of complete nothing. They were nothing. They didn't have their firstborns. They didn't have their idols. The animals that they worshipped were being slaughtered by the Jews. They were reduced to absolutely nothing. And this was the final straw, because God wanted that the Egyptians should not let the Jews out when they were on top and they were powerful and they were a benevolent nation letting their slaves go free. No, they would be reduced to the lowest form of the greatest form of weakness and the greatest form of lowliness, and then the Jews would emerge as the victors. So with each plague, the Egyptians were getting smaller and smaller, and the Jews were getting weaker again. The Jews were getting stronger and stronger, and the Egyptians were getting smaller and smaller. And that was the new dynamic that God wanted the Jews to experience, was that they were getting stronger as their former captors and their former masters were becoming nothing. And there was only one home where a firstborn had not been killed, and that was in the royal palace. Pharaoh was still alive, along with his firstborn daughter, Batya. And now Batya had saved Moshe, and Batya was living a life where she did believe in God, and so she was not killed. She, in fact, was not hit with any of the plagues. And Moshe was not leaving his home. Remember, the Jews are not leaving their homes. And Pharaoh is so scared that he actually leaves his palace. He doesn't have any ministers. He doesn't have any advisors. They're all dead. And he starts running through the streets looking for Moshe and Aaron. And this was such an incredible shift in power, because in all of the times that Moshe and Aaron had come to the palace and Paro had scoffed at them and had blown them off and had ignored them and everything, now he's running through the streets like a madman looking for Moshe. And what does he want to tell them? Go, leave, please, just don't let me die. And the Jews are not leaving their homes, and Pharaoh doesn't know where to go to look for Moshe. And whether or not he was wearing pajamas, it's a safe bet that he might have been wearing pajamas because it was after midnight. But that's where the song Pharaoh in Pajamas in the Middle of the Night comes from, because it was the middle of the night. And Paro is running through the streets, and the Jews look out their windows. Now, they didn't leave their homes. They're looking out their windows, and they hear Paro, the king of Egypt, running through the streets yelling, Moshe, where are you? Just go. And God actually miraculously made Paro's voice get amplified so that everyone in Egypt heard his desperate cries. And the Jews cannot believe their eyes. They're looking out the window and they see Paro. And Paro starts knocking on the doors. Moshe, is this your house? Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? And the Jews start pointing him in the direction of Moshe's house. And the kids decide to have a little fun. Come on, kids playing pranks is not something new. So they say, oh, Moshe's house is that way. So they start running. And then another kid goes, no, his house is that way. And he's running in circles through the streets looking for Moshe. And finally, he gets to the door where Moshe and Aaron and their family are eating the Korban Pesach. And he bangs on the door and he says, Moshe, come out. And he says, sorry, I am not leaving my home. And he says, but you can leave. You can go. No, thanks. No, thanks. Seriously? Moshe says, we're not going to leave now in the middle of the night like we're fugitives running away, escaping. We're going to leave tomorrow in the middle of the day in broad daylight. We're going to leave. That's when we're going to go. Tonight, we're at home celebrating our freedom. And Paro says, but what about my life? Moshe says, don't worry. God doesn't want you to die. God wants you to live because it's more of a punishment for him to live and see the Jews leaving as victors and as proud, free people than for him to just die. And Paro returns to his palace, knowing that the Jews are going to leave tomorrow and there is nothing he can do about it. And that's what happened. The following day, the Jews left Egypt with their families, with their animals, with their possessions, with their own treasures, meaning the treasures that they owned previously that the Egyptians had taken away from them and that the Jews now repossessed after going to the Egyptian neighbors and saying, you have this treasure. I know exactly where it is because remember in the plague of darkness, the Jews were able to see. So they were able to go into the homes and, do a little scavenger hunt and figure out exactly where everything was. And the Egyptians actually were so terrified of the Jews that they just let them take even their own treasures. And they cleaned Egypt out. And they left proudly, with such confidence, with so much pride, and with so much faith. And they left Egypt. And the Egyptians not only lost their slaves, but they were reduced to nothing along the way. And this sent such a powerful message to all of the nations of the world. You cannot enslave us. And not only did God release the Jews from the Egyptian bondage, but God made it impossible for any other nation to truly enslave the Jewish people from then on. And the way that God did that was by making us his servants. Now, it's impossible to serve two people at once. If somebody is a slave and they're owned by another person, they don't have their own free will, so they cannot choose to serve another person. So, what God did was form this alliance with the Jewish people, so to speak, where we serve God and we align our will with the will of God, which makes it impossible for us to submit to the will of any other nation. And so God not only took us out of Egypt, he took us out of slavery. And it's interesting to note this because there have been many, many nations that have and continue to terrorize us as Jewish people, but they never own us. They don't own our will. They might hurt us. They might torture us. They might expel us from their lands. They might capture our people, but they never own our will because our will is not our own. It is aligned with God's will. And if we think about it and we look throughout history and we see all of the nations who try to destroy us, they don't really exist anymore in any real sense. If you go to Egypt, there are Egyptians, but there's no Egyptian empire. There are Romans, and they make delicious food, but there's no Roman Empire. And there's no Persian Empire. They make delicious food too. Basically, every empire that tried to destroy us, we survived and we adopted their cuisine. Pretty much. But we're still here. And the reason we're still here is because our essence is aligned with an eternal essence. Our essence is aligned with God, which makes us eternal. And that was the alliance that was formed when the Jews left Egypt. Now, it wasn't all a bed of roses when we left Egypt. It wasn't all smooth sailing. In fact, when the Jews left Egypt, they entered into the desert. And they had enough food because they had packed some of the matzah that they had had from their journey previously. But they ended up in the desert and they didn't know where they were going to get food from for long because at some point, the food would run out. Even though they were Jewish moms, they didn't eat an everlasting amount of food. Sometimes when you go on a trip with a Jewish mom, it looks like there's going to be food for forever, right? But nothing lasts forever. So the Jews were now in the beginning stages of their journey in Egypt. They still had enough food, and they would eventually get the manna, the man from heaven, which was this divine food source that sustained them. And there was a rock that provided water for them in the merit of Miriam. And in the meantime, the Jews are traveling and they are following a divine guide because the cloud of glory, God's physical presence in the form of a cloud, was at the front of the camp and they would just follow it. At night, it would turn into a pillar of fire so that they could see it and they could travel. And they camped along the way. And then they get to a body of water. And they don't know what to do. And this was God testing them because God told Moshe to keep on traveling. And so Moshe told the Jews, let's travel. But there's a sea in front of them. And on both sides, there were wild animals. There was danger on both sides. So the Jews didn't have an alternate route. So they didn't know what to do. And all of a sudden, they start hearing footsteps behind them, horses galloping behind them. And they realize that the Egyptians had a buyer's remorse, or maybe it was seller's remorse. I don't know which one. But they were regretting the fact that they had let the Jews go. And so the Egyptians, with Paro at the head, were chasing after the Jews to come reclaim them as their slaves. And this is when the Jews are met with the first real test of their faith in the desert. And this is actually what is recounted in this week's Torah portion. The Jews were actually divided into 4 camps. They had 4 different opinions of what they should do. One group said, let's just go back to Egypt. There's the devil you know and the devil you don't know. Egypt is the devil we know. Let's just go back to Egypt. The other group said, no way. Let's prepare to fight. Let's fight them. Another group of people said, if we go back to Egypt, we may as well die. So let's just jump into the water as just commit suicide. Let's just kill ourselves. And the 4th group said, let's pray to God. If you were in Egypt, what would you choose? If you were in this situation, you had just left Egypt, and now you're out of Egypt, what would you choose? You don't have to say it out loud, but answer honestly. If you were in this moment, you were in Egypt, and now you left Egypt, and you had the Egyptians behind you, what would you do? Which one do you think is the right choice? Reading God. Well, first of all, this is actually a scenario that comes up in our lives. This is something that, even though we're like, such a crazy story, right? This will never happen to me. It happens. Sometimes we come out of a toxic situation, or we come out of a challenge, or we come out of an unhealthy situation, and then we're faced with that situation all over again, and we feel like we should just jump back into it. And we need to remember that we cannot go back to the slavery mindset. We cannot fall back into our own ways. So what do? Do we just go back? Because at least we know what to do. So maybe now we'll be stronger and we'll handle it better. Do we fight it? Do we just fall into another bad habit because this is a worse habit than the other one, or maybe this one's better than the other one, or we just, self-sabotage? Or do we stand and pray? I see a lot of you think standing and praying is a good idea. But here's the thing. None of those were right. Because you pray to God when you don't know what to do. But when God tells you what to do, you listen to God. What did God say? Keep going. So there's an obstacle in front of you? Okay, trust me. I'm going to get you through this obstacle. Keep going. Don't pay attention to what's behind you. Don't come up with ways to fight what's behind you. Just keep moving forward. And there was one man. His name was Nachshon ben Aminadav. And he followed Moshe's instructions based on what God had said. He said, if Hashem told Moshe to move ahead, we move ahead. And he started walking right into the water. And that's what God wanted. God wanted this show of faith. Do we really trust that if God says to go forward, we'll go forward even though there's an obstacle in front of us? And he said yes. And he started going. And the water came up to his ankles and he kept on going. And the water came up to his knees and he kept on going. And the water came up to his waist and his shoulders. And the water was right here. And that's when God told Moshe to raise his staff over the sea and split the sea. And that's when the sea split. And that's when the Jews were able to pass through on dry land. Now, there's so much to unpack about the story, and we'll get into the details because it's incredible, and the miracles that happened in the splitting of the sea are so incredible. But the lesson is so profound. When we leave a challenge and we encounter a new one, that's when we need to keep on moving forward. That's when God is really testing us to see, do we believe? Do we have the fortitude to keep on moving? And that's when we get to go forward and keep on going, even when we feel like we might be drowning, because we trust and we believe that God will split the sea before us. And the Jews walked through on dry land. In fact, the water actually separated into 12 different passageways. So each tribe was able to walk through. So it wasn't like a huge amount of time because there was a tremendous amount of people. So if they all had to walk through on one passage, it would take a long time for them to all get through. But there were 12 different passages, and the Jews were able to walk through, and it was beautiful. To picture it, think of it like the water turned into ice walls, except it wasn't actually ice. It was liquid that turned solid, but yet still looked like liquid. It was very miraculous. And they were able to see through and see all of the underwater life. And there were delicious fruits and vegetables growing out of the water that they were able to pick off and eat. There were little fountains of water coming out of the water walls. The only way I could picture how to describe it, whenever they were thirsty. And they were walking through on dry land. And they had this beautiful, incredible experience of walking through until they made it to the other side. And the Egyptians followed them because they were still going forward and going. They were ready to catch them. And as soon as the last bit of the Jews walked onto dry land, that was when all of the Egyptians were on this dry land passageway as well. But when the last of the Jews were off it, and all of the Jews were safe, and all of the Egyptians were in this incredible, miraculous experience, the water came crashing back down on the Egyptians. And that was the end of the destruction of the Egyptians. And the Midrash actually describes that the Egyptians died in stages. Those who had, at the very end, showed a little bit of remorse for the Jews, they died instantly. They didn't have to suffer. Those who were okay, they suffered a little and then they died. And those who had really hated the Jews all the way till the end, they were struck with a plague of darkness under the water. And that was the question you asked last time, the seventh day of darkness. They were stuck in the water, feeling like they were drowning for an entire day until they died. And this was the last bits of what was holding the Jews back, because they always had this fear of the Egyptians. And now there was not a trace of the Egyptians. And the Jews watched as their entire nightmare literally was washed away. And the jewels and the treasures that the Egyptians had because they had very fancy carriages, all washed up on the shore. And they were able to take all of those jewels and all of those treasures. Later, they actually used it to build the temple, to build the Mishkan. And the joy and the relief and the tremendous amount of happiness and gratitude that the Jews felt at that moment led them to burst into song. And that is the song that we say in our prayers, the song of Az Yashir Moshe. The song of Az Yashir Moshe Ubnei Israel, which is the song where we praise God and thank Hashem for the incredible miracles. Now, the women were also able to celebrate and sing and dance. But the women took it up a notch because they also had musical instruments. And think about it. They left Egypt in a hurry. They had one day to prepare. They weren't allowed to leave their homes. They took their matzah with them, so they obviously didn't pack too many sandwiches, because wouldn't it be nice if they did? Then we would have Passover, we'd eat chocolate cake for a week. But they didn't. Yet they had tambourines. They had these musical instruments. They had these this way of celebrating. And this idea is something that we discussed in previous classes. But first of all, it's definitely an important lesson to always remind ourselves. And for anyone who has missed previous classes, it's a really powerful message. How did they have these tambourines? It wasn't something that they packed. They had it because the Jewish women kept tambourines on them at all times throughout the slavery. They always held on to their tambourines because they were so sure that they would one day be redeemed and they would have reason to celebrate. And that is an incredible testament to the faith of the Jewish women. But it's even more than that. Because we are the last generation before the coming of Mashiach. We carry the souls and the energy and the essence of those women. That is our generation. And yet, I can only speak for myself, but I know that my faith is not always in perfect form. I know that there are times when I question, and I'm sure we can all think of the times when we're not so sure. We have the underlying basis of faith, but is it always as strong as ever that we're always ready to dance and sing and celebrate? So if we are like those women, what were they like then? So the truth is that the women in Egypt were the same way. They also sometimes struggled with their faith. They also sometimes had questions. But that's why they had their tambourines. The tambourines weren't just there because they always had faith. The tambourines were a reminder to have their faith. The tambourines, the musical instruments, when they walked and they would hear the jingle, it would remind them that we will celebrate one day. And that is the power of faith. It's that it's not always perfect, but we keep ourselves strong and we strengthen ourselves and each other to be able to have this incredible, powerful, beautiful strength to keep on going. But it's not always shiny and bright lights. Sometimes it's hard and we're scared and we're not feeling it. But we have things to remind ourselves to start feeling it again. And going back to what we spoke about at the beginning, when the Jews took the sheep and they tied it to their beds, it wasn't that they weren't afraid. It was that their faith was stronger than their fear. And that was the power of the Jewish women, that their faith was stronger than their despair. Their faith was stronger than their will to give up. The tambourines served as a reminder, and they merited to dance and sing with those tambourines. And believe me, the men were definitely lacking once the women pulled out their musical instruments. I mean, it's one thing the men can sing, but the women had music to dance to. And that tells us about ourselves as well, that when we're looking for our own personal redemption, and when we're looking to experience our own personal exodus, we need to find our own tambourine. We need to find our own beautiful way of feeling the strength of, we will get through this. We will come out of this. I will not be a slave to this forever. And there is so much that we can learn from every single part of the story, from every single chapter of this incredible part of our history. But most importantly, is that it doesn't remain in history, but rather that we live with these experiences in our own personal lives, and that we work towards our own personal redemption. And no, I don't mean you should unleash frogs and boils upon any of your enemies, but that we can release the feeling within us of whatever it is that's holding us back and experience our own redemption. And I want to end with a l'chaim on water or whatever you guys are drinking.
A little bit, please.
Yes. I want to give all of us a l'chaim, a wish, a hope, and a blessing that we should each be able to feel our own personal exodus, our own personal out of Egypt, and that we are each leaving our own Mitzrayim, because Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt, but it can also be read as Meitzarim. And Meitzarim are boundaries, are limitations. So along with leaving our Mitzrayim, along with leaving the exile that we are in nowadays, globally, as a Jewish nation, for all of humanity, we should also be able to leave our own personal Mitzrayim, our own personal Meitzarim, and whatever it is that is holding us back, we should be able to burst through it and feel like we are out of Egypt. So l'chaim to that. And I also want to make a suggestion. So I haven't made any confirmations yet. And Bezrat Hashem, next week, we will not be having Torah class. I'm actually going to be heading to New York for the Chabad Women's Conference, of when you basically put a couple thousand Rebbetzins in a room and watch what happens. And after that, before we start our next series, we're going to be having some sort of an event with an activity. We haven't done one of those in a while. And I had a few ideas. And one of the ideas I had is actually something that we've done recently, that we've done previously in the past, but we would do it a little differently. So the idea of us women having tambourines is something that is so, so important and so, so powerful. And sometimes we actually need a physical reminder. So I was thinking, we have done tambourine decorating in the past. Some of you might still have your tambourine that we did. I feel like it was, what, 2 summers ago that we did the tambourine painting?
I missed.
You missed it. So you missed it also. It was not this past summer. It was the summer before. I'll tell you how I know. I was in the early stages of my pregnancy with Leah. But if you already have a tambourine in your home, you need to add one to your collection. But this workshop is actually a really unique one, and it is such a beautiful activity. So if everyone's on board, even if you already have a tambourine, I was thinking of doing this again. It is going to be a 3-dimensional multimedia art on a tambourine. It's really beautiful. And if any of you have had a tambourine discussion with me, you know I already have a huge tambourine collection. I keep many of them on the wall of my closet in my room. I'm definitely ready for Mashiach. And if you think that when Mashiach comes, you're not going to have a tambourine. Don't worry, I'll have one for you. I will have one for you, but you need to have your own. I even keep one in my car because what if I'm driving when Mashiach comes? I keep one in my car too. So we will be doing tambourine decorating, or we can do a different project. So you don't have to answer now, but I'll probably put up a poll on the group chat, and we'll finalize dates. For those of you who usually join on Zoom, I highly recommend you come in person for this one. But whether you have a tambourine or not, find that one item, that one message, whatever it is that you can hold on to, whether it's an object or something that you listen to or a person that you talk to, that you hold on to when you feel like you need a boost of faith, a boost of confidence, and someone to propel you forward so that you don't, God forbid, decide to go back to Egypt, but instead you jump into the sea because that's just an obstacle that God is waiting to part for you. Find that, whatever it is, and hold on to it because we are crossing through the sea onto dry land together. If anyone has any questions, I feel like I end every class. If anyone has any questions, and then the recording usually ends. One in the car is a great